Hello everyone, today we make a cultural comparison between the Carolingian Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate, chiefly in fact during the 9th century. And this, I think it's interesting at this point because I've made several videos about both the Franks and the Caliphate in general. During this specific period that saw in fact the rise of these two big entities that, albeit from different backgrounds, naturally, not just from a strictly religious or political point of view, but also in the way they matured and processed. And part of the discussion today will be in fact also about this and its consequences, cultural consequences. And just recently I was talking about this, the expansion of especially of the Islamic Empire, and looking at also the transfer. I made so many videos about the Carolingian society, and recently one about Carolingian Renaissance. So I believe at this point it's, at least for the regular viewers, it's kind of interesting to address this point. And this is an important point because it's difficult even to introduce this because the European revival during this time, from the 8th century, normally it's at least spotted historiographically. Then during the 9th, there is this sort of consolidation at the very beginning of the Carolingian Empire, then effectively crumbles, and with the 10th century there is this new period of mess that fundamentally, however, still has in itself the seeds for the eventual and much stronger revival of the following centuries that effectively started from Carolingian times. I made a video that can be useful to understand what I'm talking about, which is entitled, if I remember correctly, Franks and Arabs, Two Empires Compared. And in that video, in fact, was talking chiefly about the consequences of what happened afterwards, because we have fundamentally a Latin Germanic Europe that is very slowly growing. Okay, it's very difficult to even spot this improvement over time if you don't look at in the perspective of centuries, century-wide, let's say. The Caliphate, let's say Islamic Caliphate, and chiefly the Abbasid Empire at this point are instead rocketing to the stars in this 8th, 9th century, and and this is kind of a microscopical evidence. It's obvious that the Carolingian Empire was, substantially backward compared to the Caliphate. There is no comparison. Caliphate was basically a centralized state with a professional army, with bureaucracy, administration. It stretched, it controlled in a statal fashion, in fact, huge chunks of the Middle and Near East. The Carolingian Empire was very big, and sometimes it's underrated how, in fact, how the Franks even managed to achieve what they did, especially after that the Frankish kingdom during the 7th century had effectively vanished in itself. I mean, it had split into 4 different kingdoms. They didn't really were able to make it work like that. But it's evident the Carolingian Empire was in great part a blending of new clientele, so of emerging clientele, and channeling them towards this chiefly military expansionism that basically fueled the structures of government at this point that were actually not even structures. I mean, the whole empire was fundamentally an empire, was something based on the military deterrent in terms of political control of this huge area. And the greatest proof of this is it basically crumbled, basically in 2 generations. And it wasn't even something externally caused, it was really all internal. The Carolingians effectively didn't have anything like a true state. They tried to basically commit other elements into the society, like chiefly the ecclesiastical entities, and making them participate to the system. But this was so privatized since the beginning. The same church was fundamentally in the Frankish world part of the private aristocracy, the one that effectively caused the fall of the Carolingian Empire, that the whole thing didn't work. And in the video we made last time about the Carolingian Renaissance, we were stressing actually the greatest legacies of the Carolingian Empire, including this cultural reform, this re-education, fundamentally, of the Frankish clergy, chiefly, that brought within itself lots of very important changes. Basically created a net of monastic a monastic net of cultural centers that were in constant contact, and that effectively survived not only the Carolingian Empire but also the Sagunt invasions, and created what we can call a truly European culture, at least at this elite level, the ecclesiastical level, that wasn't reasoning anymore in terms of the single Romano-Germanic kingdoms, but in kind of a universal fashion now once again, because there had been certain universals that had been set. And in that video, Franks and Arabs compared. However, I was stressing chiefly instead another great legacy that effectively was not really indirect, but it wasn't really an invention of the Carolingians themselves. It was something that pre-existed them and kept existing afterwards. That were the Vassalatic clienteles, right? So the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system that was eventually to evolve into what we call feudalism, that incredibly remolded, reshaped the European society at all levels, right? It even brought in itself actually an impoverishment of the middle classes. It kind of stratified society, increasingly verticized society, but it was at the same time able to be fertile. It was like a new sap for Europe. It's from the seigneurial system that effectively the same development of cities, international trade were recovered, and Europe set itself in motion and basically kept growing without any discontinuity. Just there's this minor setback of the Black Death, but that was a massive structural trauma that affected the whole Eurasia, and it doesn't have to be considered itself as a cause of the weakness of the system. The Islamic world didn't really have that. The Islamic world had this great phase of expansion that was immediately able to synthesize and assimilate and synthesize in order the great cultures and civilizations of the regions that were expanded, and it effectively created what at this time, the 9th century, was the most advanced country at least in Western Eurasia, and Baghdad at this time is a capital of culture, of theological studies, of technology. It was effectively the most advanced country in the world. When you look at well, maybe China actually, but in Western Eurasia, definitely, if you look at the diplomatic gifts that the Carolingians and the Abbasids exchanged, like the Abbasids sent all sophisticated things, extremely refined silks, textiles, but also a clock, a mechanic clock, showing all this massive technology that the Muslims were developing this time. The Carolingians effectively sent something like horses and some rough textiles. And that was the comparison, and not that it's so bad, because it makes you understand what the two worlds were about, right? And there would be many things to comment on this, even the value of a gift like, the horses. Horses were important in this world, also in the Islamic world, but these were war horses, if I'm not wrong. And even the Islamic world was in great search for that. I mean, if you think about, the Islamic expansion in regions like Transoxiana and far beyond in Fergana, this area where the Fergana horses were basically the best war horses ever exported, both in China and in the Middle East. It was something, but it's still two different mindsets. It's still two different perspectives of the world, and and that video was effectively observing that, however, the Islamic world after the 10th century, the 11th century, didn't have the same expansion that Europe was to have. Actually, Europe and the Near East, let's say the Islamic world, narrowly meant, um, were remained fundamentally in parallel in terms of developments, etc., until I think roughly the 16th century. You can argue whether on which basis you can say this, because I believe that it actually started earlier, in as early as this time, like actually the 11th century, etc. This is partly valid also for the same Byzantine Empire, that in this sense had much more similar structural developments to worlds like the Muslim one than the one of Western Europe. That can be regarded, if you want, as an exception, and I think it would be very important to investigate historiographically the causes of this and how this happened, because up to now we basically registered just the consequences, right? But what about the causes? I mean, there surely is some environmental factor in it, which is evident. Europe has a particular climate, particular resources, and terrain, etc. But let's be honest, early medieval Europe was pretty backwards, especially continental Europe. Northern Europe were far backwards compared to the Mediterranean, compared to the Near East, etc. So it's all the more amazing how effectively the European Europe, let's say in general, managed to expand and to become the colossus that effectively was at the end of the Middle Ages on this basis, while this point is that the Byzantine world didn't exist anymore, and the Islamic one was still struggling to find a center, better center. In fact, what emerged as the most structured empire from Islam was the Ottoman Empire. There was a far more European empire than Asian empire. It was based, in fact, not just on the Byzantine tradition, but it also encompassed, and it was way more Westerner in mindset, especially than what we imagined. But aside from this, today I would like to look a bit backwards, let's say in reverse, and to observe how, in fact, distant these two worlds were in terms of development at this time during the 9th century, when you can compare these two great empires, because Europe was basically not to have any empire anymore. Something, say a continental power, like in Carolingian times, that there would be, of course, the Holy Roman Empire, but that was this, let's say, long stripe of Central Europe that encompassed several countries, yes, and kingdoms, but it effectively never reached, if anything, the territorial extension of the Carolingian Empire, and especially its unity of control, right? So the Byzantines definitely made it, especially during the 11th, 12th century, to re-expand enormously, but effectively they were to crumble at the beginning of the 13th century, and even there you find a bit of the same dynamic, right? So this actually pretty good basis that arrived intact till the 11th century. In the case of the Byzantine world, even beyond, because the Byzantine world wasn't really so sclerotic as we imagine it. At the time of its fall, but nevertheless there was something structurally wrong, because a solid empire doesn't vanish just because a bunch of crusaders arrive in 1204 and take Constantinople and the whole empire crumbles. So it's it has deeper roots that you can study even in relation, I don't know, with Italian maritime republics that effectively take over Byzantine navy. They become even economically way more aggressive, competitive, entrepreneurial, and they effectively surpass the Byzantine world in the Mediterranean, and in fact feudal Europe proper that effectively originates in this Carolingian times, where at least the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system was really settled as a standard political and social system, and that obviously evolves because naturally the Vassalatic system wasn't the same. It wasn't as solid, let's say, in the 9th century like in the 11th, not even like in the 13th. So there was even here a very slow growth. This is important to underline for the West, especially in this these first centuries, but something that was irreversible, and it was very solid and structural. So it's as if it in many ways it started from the bottom, while the Muslims arrived in a world that was already very much structured. Like they found from one side Roman territories, from the other the Persian ones, that were both advanced empires with a centralized bureaucracy, permanent army, etc. So they basically just settled the thing. So they simply refilled reoccupied those structures. But it's as if these structures didn't quite make it to transform into something else. The Carolingians effectively carried out a sort of social engineering that unexpectedly worked, and the Carolingians didn't quite understand this. I mean, it wasn't just a long planned term to say, okay, well, let's modify Europe and let's make it rocket to the stars, like where in the 19th century it controls literally the whole world. They didn't know about that. But if you look at it in a long-range perspective, it all kind of started from there. I mean, even the same political weakness that you can spot at this time with the fragmentation of Europe in post-Carolingian times, it seemingly, today's historiographical interpretations stress on how basically this taught the Europeans to compartmentalize their resources, to put them in motion, to invest, to look at the thing from the local perspective and to make economy from it. Differently from these huge centralized empires that, as such, they wasted way more resources every time they moved by the foe, and basically caused systemic collapse and impoverished the whole system in itself. I mean, this has been observed especially at the end of the late Middle Ages, where the effective, very advanced banking is in place in Europe, and there is the Ottoman advance. What you see during the Ottoman advance is that the Ottomans, well, at a certain point, of course, they are stopped, but in the process, Europe behaves in a way that basically as if everybody was on their own, and therefore everyone preserved its own share of the cake, right? And Europe didn't bleed itself white to fight the Ottomans, like a country like France, for instance, supported the Ottomans during the modern age, so that they were all playing, let's say, from their own perspective, and therefore kind of making even best choices at a strictly managerial and economical point of view. But we're going far beyond. So what I would like to start with is to stress, first of all, the speed that we already said, with which the Arab, and I would say Arab/Persian world of the Abbasids assimilated and renewed the forms of Hellenistic and Eastern culture. So this is pretty evident. The Abbasids were heavily influenced, definitely, not just by the Romans, but especially by the Persians. And Persia, that was definitely encompassed, at least nominally, into the Abbasid Empire, was definitely this great pole of culture that massively influenced even the imperial the forms of the Caliphate, its court. Hell, the Persians had even managed to influence the Byzantine court that freaking resembled it a lot. It kept emanating scholars, thinkers. If you look at the greatest thinkers in the Islamic world at this time, were mostly all from Persia, from Khorasan, from all these places that were pretty important, and that really hadn't started with Islam. As we know, these were areas that were from millennia, literally, across these two continents of Europe and Asia. Or better, let's say, from between the Near East and the Far East, because Europe definitely during ancient times mostly resented in terms of civilization of this kind of millenary civilizations that had existed in Mesopotamia, etc. And they kept expanding and influencing. So what the Abbasids managed to do in many ways was to, they were heavily Persianized also, into, think about the Seljuk Turks that come at the end of this period to effectively control the Caliphate, nominally defending it, de facto keeping the Caliph in Baghdad as an hostage and dealing with the military stuff. And those were heavily Persified Turks as well. So there is this Iranian dimension that is never to be forgotten in this process. And the Iranian dimension helped dramatically, even from a sheer philosophical, cultural point of view, to the Muslims to blend the Hellenistic and Eastern culture, so that what you see that comes back from the East into Europe from the 12th century, etc., all these transcriptions, etc. You're not talking actually about the ancient Greek texts, just plain and simple as they were. They were actually heavily Persianized. They had brought a lot of other wisdom and knowledge, etc., coming from the Indian tradition, from the Chinese tradition, from the same Persian tradition that was blending. So way more enriched, and that also what gave the medieval civilization such vivacious and dynamic and original and effervescent intellectual dynamism, right? In character, let's say, and this is often underestimated because we like to think that Europe, basically, for what was from one side, these guys were from the other. But as a matter of fact, Europeans at this time were drawing, I wouldn't say even heavily, but massively from all this huge amount of knowledge. In part had even been lost. Even in the same Byzantine Empire, it was theoretically the depository of the ancient Hellenistic knowledge and civilization, had in this sense a bit, kind of slowed down, because it had paradoxically stagnated in there. It had kind of intensified the truly Hellenistic nature of knowledge, etc. That, in this sense, Islam gave to Hellenistic knowledge a much greater dynamism. When we think about the great libraries of Alexandria, etc., we don't have to think that were actually people there reading those books. Those were like big stock houses, where there was a huge knowledge deposited in there, but just like one literate of court going there every once in a while, studying just one book, and that's it. In medieval times, in Arab times, all the knowledge that was found, all the manuscripts, etc., that were found by the Muslims, now were instead brought, read avidly, rethought. The greatness was this original synthesis that the Islamic thinkers were able to do of these ancient texts. So conjugating them with the monotheistic religion and all these other cultural influxes and knowledge and sciences. Think about maths from India, etc. These other Eastern philosophies, etc. So definitely and massively enriching this world. So, and not even in the Byzantine world it was like that. In the Byzantine world, in part, being a more unitary, and this is also a character of it, was kind of more like all about the court, about that environment, and it was way less dynamism in many ways. At this point, the Islamic world is way more dynamic, economically speaking, and its political fragmentation, because obviously there is not just the Abbasid Empire, there are many other centers. The Abbasid Empire is basically today's Iraq, and it depends on also which times we were talking about, but the center is Mesopotamia, effectively. It extended way around, of course, but sometimes it was very much decentralized at that point. There were many other centers. Think about the Samanids in Transoxiana, or the Fatimids in Egypt, the Umayyads in Spain, the Aghlabids in Tunisia. So there were these old many centers that, if you go in the Islamic medieval Islam playlist, I've made actually a lot of videos about this topic, and there is especially one, if you want to hear a search that talks specifically about all these other centers, to stress the fact that it wasn't, the Islamic world wasn't a unique block at all, and this arguably since the very beginning actually, but this in part favored dialogue, favored sharing ideas, and and political gaming that, in this sense, made ideas circulate also in a kind of an antagonistic way, like so that different ideals could be presented. This stimulated the theoretical speculation, and these are very important aspects of world that in this sense has to tank its fragmentation. These damn playlists have become so many that I can't even find same videos, but the video I wanted to show, I was talking to you about is, oh yeah, this other is interesting. You can watch it in a bit as an introduction, a complement to this. Its title is The Cultural Influence of Medieval Islam, and in there I stress very much these concepts, so let's just skip them for now because it's in there. I won't be repeating myself. And so when you compare this world to Europe, and especially Western Europe, you realize that things are very, very different, because what you see effectively is the slowness, I can't find a better term in this sense, of the world dominated by the Germanic dynasties in the West, into deepening the ties, the cultural ties between the Western Christendom with the ancient intellectual traditions. And this is it's not so paradoxical, but it still makes you reflect, because the West definitely had its own extremely important religious and theological experience that had in common with the Byzantine Empire as the direct continuator of the Roman Empire and of Hellenism especially. So Europe had actually its own debates, its own thinkers, its own scholars. Think about the great fathers of the church, think about figures like St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, but also the Greek world was pretty close in many ways, but yet there was an extremely slow development of this, awareness of the past that definitely always existed as such. We don't have to never to think about the Middle Ages as a moment, as if there had been an atomic bomb before and nobody knew what had happened before. Taking the average person as an example, it's not useful, because not even in the Roman Empire the average person knew that much about the past. You have to think from the perspective of the elites, and observing that objectively medievals, even in the what is supposed to be the darkest hour of the early medieval times, were perfectly aware of the existence of the Greeks, of the Romans, of this great past, of the Christian Empire, of Constantine, of Theodosius, of Justinian, etc. And they were perfectly capable of picturing themselves in relation with this world, but at the same time they didn't go far beyond intellectually speaking. It was much of a speculative attitude. It was just sometimes a passive repetition. A repetition was extremely useful, even however, for the following developments, because these were the centuries where this Benedictine monks made this astonishing work of copying, of transcription, saving effectively a huge amount of material that went lost, not because the Christians had destroyed pagan works, but simply because literally people were not interested in reading anymore. When there is the social collapse, late antique society, everybody goes working on the land. It's a survival rate economy. Nobody has even the time to read or to spend for education. Even this is kind of dramatic in its explanation, but I'm trying to make a point in here. However, if you're interested about these topics, just be aware, if you go in my medieval Christianity playlist, made a lot of videos about early medieval Christian education, which is, I can give you even the titles in part. One is definitely Christian education in the early Middle Ages. Because also here, education had remained fluid. I mean, in early medieval Europe, at this time, if you wanted to learn, if you want to be educated, you effectively could, even if you were a layman. The problem was, who was interested to do it and what for? In a world that has a crop rate that doesn't leave much room for any kind of surplus, then the problem is effectively production. Reading can be useful, but just for a very narrow amount of the population. I made other videos like there is Christian and classical culture in late antiquity that can be useful. I made something else about we will definitely find there is else for sure. I can't find it now, but it's not important. However, the most important thing now is to at least address you towards something more dedicated to that specific topic. So, and let's give a look at time, really at the speed of the education development in Islam and in Christianity at this point. So, or let's say better, into these two areas, macro areas. Of course, even in the Islamic world, were areas that were completely ignorant. I mean, we don't have to think about the Islamic world at this point like everybody knew how to read, or everybody would, absolutely not. Just saying that the structures that the political entities, the political institutions were able to build for education, for intellectual development, etc., were pretty based and powerful and solid and etc. So here, at 2 centuries, at barely 2 centuries from the sudden Arab expansion, remember these guys came literally from the deserts, were semi-nomads, etc. The Caliph Al-Mamun, ruling from between 1833 and 1833, already exercised this enormous, most generous patronage of the arts, right? He founded in Baghdad this great library and academy. He promoted an intense translation into Arabic of Greek and Syrian texts, but as well as Iranian and Indian texts of the most diverse scientific and philosophical content, right? So, as we have explained just a few days ago, definitely the Arabs, this is what we would call as the Arabs, weren't quite Arabs as we imagine. The fact that the ethnic Arabs that went out there during the Islamic conquests to conquer and settle elsewhere were a few, right? Were a few, and they blended immediately with the local population. So we can't definitely talk about the Arabs as if this wasn't happening in the Arabian Peninsula. Effectively, this was happening in areas that were already very advanced. Right, it is true, but these areas were refilled, let's say, by the Muslims with all this great intellectual dynamism. The Muslims didn't just say, okay, we're in origin. I mean, the Arabs didn't say we're just tribesmen from the desert. Let's burn everything down. Let's make everything work without too many concerns, etc. in the way we were used to. And what is this civilization? No, the Muslims effectively preserve even the myth that the Muslims destroyed books and stuff like that. And that is a myth that the same Muslims created in the first hour and expansion of Islam, and just that one, by the way, to say things like, I don't have to read any book but the Quran, right? And the same guys who were doing this to, show that they were the great leaders of the faith, the great fighters and warriors of Islam, etc., were instead the same ones who, together with the Quran, made an extensive read and treasured lots of books, right? The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed by the Islamic invasion. as well as many other libraries, and there is an astonishing amount of evidence of all the knowledge that actually had been lost, even in places like the Byzantine Empire, that the Muslims instead preserved from those Byzantine libraries that had ceased in places like Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, etc. So we can say that the Arabs immediately absorbed this culture. The way it happened was, well, it's difficult to tell even why this happened, and this instead with the Romano-Germanic Europe took so much more. The truth is that, in my opinion, this is often overlooked, is that if you look at Europe itself, it's not that before the Roman conquest, even after Roman conquest, the local society was, dramatically developed. Like in areas like Central and Northern Europe, think about Gaul and Britain, definitely the Romans were able to export their their urbanization, their road networks, etc. But at the same time, these were effectively areas that had been tribal up to a very few centuries before. I mean, entirely tribal, that didn't have a great deal of development. We often forget about this, that even Rome emerged initially from a rather primitive background, right? So areas like Central Europe, and this is in defense actually of the Romano-Germanic world, because a few a couple of or say some centuries of Roman domination definitely brought to great changes into the local society, but also didn't immediately turn the Central European lands into places like Mesopotamia or Egypt, that new millennia of civilization before were heavily urbanized, had a written culture, etc. So in this perspective, this can already be an explanation that the Muslims came to conquer a world that had not emerged from tribalism, a relatively few centuries before, but in areas that were developed, highly developed from millennia, effectively. So they were absorbed quite easily into this world, and they made it work relatively well. You can see this even in the same Byzantine Empire. Effectively, the Byzantine Empire maintained most of its vitality because of the control of the Mediterranean urbanized urban coastal centers. It's not the interland of regions like the Balkans even, or even Asia Minor for that matter, were this massive advancement. So you can even draw a line, a shape, on the map of where the Hellenistic world, I mean the real dynamic one, had survived. And that dynamism was effectively the base of the Islamic world, and in part also, together with the Persian base, let's say, that had existed in there, and the Abbasid Empire, in fact, was located at the very center of that. I mean, across the two areas. Areas like the one of the Carolingian Empire were actually still pretty barbaric lands in their nature. Even the same Carolingians, the same Franks, were not all this Romanized. They had a heavily Germanic character. They still lived. They were largely and massively literate. Let's say they were all about war. They weren't effectively even that different from the Saxons that they came to conquer, etc. So it's important to stress this this kind of cultural dimension, even because otherwise you may say, well, why was the Carolingian Empire so backwards compared to the Abbasid one, and saying, well, okay, because it was bad, because they made it function bad. No, objectively there were certain limits that are something very difficult to overcome. And yet, the Carolingians, with all their faults, with all the mistakes they did, with all the effectively the weakness of their political system, they managed to confer Europe a capacity to grow, a capacity to unify as well. Because let's not forget, the Carolingians first of all brought in Europe once again the universal dimension from a political point of view, right? If it was effectively the Ottonians who reshaped it, would gave it a kind of more definitive institutional setting, but the thing had been started by the Carolingians, and this European world, kept growing, so that you find areas like, I don't know, like Germany, that by the end of the Middle Ages was effectively one of the most advanced technologically advanced regions of the continent. I mean, 1 millennium before, those were a bunch of tribesmen that didn't even have cities. They realize what it was like. I mean, if you look at this on the perspective, in perspective, you see how effectively what happened in Europe, especially during the Middle Ages, was really impressive in terms of adding mass, expanding capacity in terms of growth, right? The Islamic world was had in proportion, after this first phase of reorganization was immediately quick, because they already had the infrastructures, the know-how ready for them, waiting. They kind of slowed down in comparison. The same goes for the Byzantine Empire. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. And this is astonishingly important in my opinion. Also because there are all these prejudices about the Middle Ages as a moment in which, this civilization seemingly barely survived, right? Everything was so messed up and poor and regressed and backwards, but this messed up, poor and regressed and backwards world managed to structure itself in a fashion that kept growing and didn't stop. So, and that survived because it had structural basis, structural fundaments for this. It was incredibly resilient. I made a video about this. I think it's titled "The Resilience of Medieval Civilization." If you look at that, this is another perspective that proves in many ways that how the Middle Ages were all but a weak period. It was maybe weak in terms of actual growth rate, and up to a certain point, because if you look at the growth rate of certain regions of Europe during between the 11th and the 14th century, you basically don't find them anywhere else. So this is also kind of false, but especially it's something that kept expanding all the time. Think about an area like Flanders. Like Flanders at the beginning of the Middle Ages were some of the poorest, most depressed areas in Europe, actually. Comes at the thresholds of a modern age, it's one of the richest, more advanced, more dynamic, more populated areas in the whole world at this time. So what the hell? They made it. Whatever happened during the Middle Ages was something amazing. In my opinion, much of this starts, in fact, thanks to the Carolingians, which, it kind of, they didn't know at the time, of course, they hadn't planned it. And actually this passed through also the oppression of the peasantry, of many, even of the middle classes, then in post-Carolingian times lost enormous part of their personal freedom, etc. But it's still something that as a whole complexively rose in an incredible fashion. So, however, from a strictly cultural point of view, let's look at what the West at the time in comparison to the Muslim world. The West of the Franks, right? So basically, at this time, the migration here era, at least in Western Europe, has finished from 4 centuries, right? Which is a lot of time actually. And so already only at this time you have, with the Carolingian Renaissance at least, this cultural cultural flourishing, a reflourishing of the, but with great timidity actually, and a culture that stopped to things like being grammatically correct. Like a big deal of even the Carolingian Renaissance was effectively to give the clergy knowledge of Latin. The Bible was in Latin in the West, and the local clergy could barely read Latin, especially in these areas of Central Europe, etc. There was a survey made by especially the popes, etc. in these areas, like if you take Bavaria, they blatantly didn't understand what they were reading. And this was a serious concern, especially for individuals like Charlemagne, who would not just needed the clergy as actually as a solid system that could cooperate with the political direction of the king, the emperor, etc., but that also still believed in a kind of superstitious way that the more and the better that the clergy prayed, and the more God would help the Franks in their empire and so on. So these were the achievements, the level of achievement that they wanted to do, to acquire. I mean, in the Abbasid court, you can find everything being read: Arabic, Persian, Greek. I'm not sure about Latin, but surely it was something about that. Indian. So just imagine what does that mean, and with the highest and most sophisticated theological treatises discussed, and the scientific research triggered with the theory application. In the West, they were effectively just trying to learn Latin properly. And Greek was definitely poorly known in the West. It was something extremely rare to have someone who knew how to speak Greek. Of course, there was someone. I'm talking obviously specifically about Western Europe, because the Byzantine Empire spoke Greek and kind of it had undergone some linguistical differences, but I don't think that for a Greek it's very difficult to understand classical Greek. While if you take Romance speakers, it's not that they automatically understand Latin. So there is a greater barrier that also came from, in fact, this transformation set according to these previous centuries. But there was, however, someone who knew how to speak Greek. There were people who, even from the British Isles, so from the fringe of Europe, that knew, because they, I don't know, maybe they had been to Rome, they had spoken with the Greek community, or they had gone to Constantinople. Greek was effectively known in Mediterranean this time, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean. So if someone went to places that now were actually Muslim held, but still important centers of the holy places, it's like Jerusalem and other centers. Think about Antioch. Antioch had a very solid and flourishing Greek Orthodox community, even during Muslim times. There were very intense contacts via sea between Italy and Egypt. So the world at this point was kind of, even in this early medieval times, was very connected. Like this is, by the way, the time of which the Vikings start to their expansion. It's widely known that at this time the Vikings basically created a trade net that stretched literally from the Caspian Sea to Iceland. and far beyond, actually, because we can find little Buddha statues in Sweden from from the Viking era, so that is pretty eloquent in itself. So actually, in the word Greek communities, as we were saying before, are also pretty close to the word Jewish communities. A lot of Jews, especially in Spain at this time, in southern Italy. So the Greek word was definitely not far, and the multilingualism was pretty out there, especially in the Mediterranean, and that's not very far from the European dimension, because still, by the way, consider that the main cultural say activity at this point in Western Europe is effectively from Mediterranean Europe. So Italy is when Charlemagne conquers the Italy. Well, that was very important for him, because there were also lots of people there who effectively were helpful for teaching Latin better than what was done in places like Francia, that even knew Greek as and so on, so that they contributed to this higher education of. So it's important that this mechanism was set in motion, that the Carolingians understood of their limits, they acknowledged them, and they tried to change this, and effectively they managed it, because after the Carolingian Renaissance, the European clergy is effectively let's say well educated on average. It's definitely knows how to handle Latin. They travel. The myth that monks were just jailed in their monastic walls is completely false. Monks were kind of used even as diplomats, etc. They traveled. They knew about worlds that were out there that maybe they hadn't even ever seen, but they knew how to describe. They knew everything about them because they had read, and they exchanged books. They treasured them, and this is effectively how part of that resilience that we were of European civilization during Middle Ages is being put in motion and revived. Another important aspect of this is the urban dimension. It's pretty evident that the Islamic world was way more urbanized than the Christian one at this time. The most important centers of the Muslim world were cities, definitely, that were chiefly trade centers. Like, the Muslims definitely at this time control, finally, if you look at it in perspective, the Romans and the Persians had struggled for centuries and centuries to control the trade routes from east and west in the Near East, right? The frontier was in there. The Muslims at this point seize both sides. So basically they control the world trade between the Mediterranean and the Far East. And therefore they acquired this enormous economical capacity of penetration, of expansion. They're very dynamic. Other video that I can suggest you is the one on the Saracens. I think the title is something like Rethinking the Saracens, that effectively talks about this, and the myth that the Arabs came and they interrupted the Mediterranean trade is pure fantasy. If after the very first moment of instability, because of war, etc., they immediately made the Mediterranean traffics re-flourish, because at that point had already been, even previous to the Muslim invasions, they had greatly contracted. They had greatly shrank. Yeah, this is the video rereading the Saracens, slavery, piracy and trade in Mediterranean, 7th, 11th century. But I'm sure I made something else as well. Yeah. You can search for that in the Medieval Islam playlist. So, if you look at great cities like Toledo, Seville, Cordoba, these were these three centers were all Muslim Spain. Those were kind of great centers, right? And that's where they were effectively, where even the same Christians from the rest of Europe went to study, to find manuscripts. And even after the Reconquista conquered these cities, well, the older translation traditions effectively continued, also because these cities were remaining close to the Muslim world, from which all the books, especially at those time of the 12th century, etc., were pouring to Europe massively with all this knowledge about Aristotle, about all the scientific treatises, and so on, etc. But think about even other dimensions that are often overlooked. Think about the great Central Asian oases like Bukhara or Samarkand. These were massive centers. We often forget that these areas like of Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, etc., were at the time some of the most inhabited regions in the world. The city of Merv was, before the 13th century Mongol conquest, was the largest city in the whole world, which means that not even in China or India or the Near East there was anything big like that, not even the great European cities of that time. These are worlds that today are kind of, this fringe between the Islamic and the post-Soviet world, and they're pretty depressed areas, but they had this huge past, and their greatness laid exactly in being frontier areas. As a matter of fact, this was the great crossroad between the Turkish world, the Persian world, the Arab world, and even beyond other populations, and they were all great trade centers, as we were saying these were on the caravan routes and so on. So there were lots of people who necessarily crossed them, but academies were founded, libraries were founded, and this wasn't just done for fun. It was done because the local politicians, the local rulers, wanted to aggrandize these centers that sometimes were, by the way, of new foundation, because even the cities didn't have such a huge history in the past of urbanization, etc., but effectively developed at this point because of these trade centers. Naturally, in Mesopotamia or in other areas, there were other great centers, but the same Baghdad had been substantially rebuilt, in fact, in Abbasid times from the previous, so there were even new centers emerging in the same Muslim world from from centers that had not been the great capitals of the ancient world. The Abbasid Caliphate was definitely the most important center of the Muslim world because of this very strong and robust statal apparatus that made converge towards the caliphal court of Baghdad some of the greatest thinkers and scholars of the time. The Abbasid Caliphate, as long as it remained functional between the decline in the 11th century, it was a model of political efficiency, of tax exploitation, and it was imitated in turn all over the Muslim world by the other Islamic emirs. So if you look at the Umayyads in Spain, or the Samanids in Transoxiana, everybody was looking at the Abbasid Caliphate and saying, okay, we have to imitate that because that's the big center, the big model, the universal symbol of Islam, etc. So we have to export this model also at these fringes of the Muslim world. So in this polycentric Islamic world with so many capitals, so big cities, international trade, you have the Latin Germanic West. That is a virtually, let's say, an almost entirely rural world, right? This is particularly clear if you look at the Carolingian world in itself. The Carolingians had their own itinerant courts, basically. Surely they had some favorite residences. Think about Aachen, that Charlemagne had built, copying it from Rome, ideally. And this was in fact chosen also by his successors of Lotharingia. There were also other centers of more ancient residence. Think about Soissons, that was even a Roman, it was the ancient center of the Syagrius kingdom, or Rheims. These were chiefly residences for the Western Franks. The Eastern Franks in Germany had centers like Regensburg in Bavaria. The Italic kingdom had this capital of Pavia, that was basically it was a Roman city, and it had become basically the capital of the peninsula during the Longobards times, and the Carolingians settled there, and there is a palace proper. You have to think about the sheer material dimension of this. I mean, in the Roman world had created this model of the palace, which means something built in stone, something massive that had to exist over time. That is not just a building, but a symbol of the eternity of the empire. So the Carolingians at this time, in their ideological renaissance, they try to emulate that, to try to stress the universality of their power, of their empire, and therefore its immortality, and stressing the importance of the palace as a center. That's why Charlemagne builds Aachen, because it builds in there. Think about the chapel, etc. All these massive stones, these massive buildings in stone, that costed a freaking lot at the time. It was amazing. Just an empire like a Carolingian one, and its acme could have the resources for building something like that. And that's why, in fact, around there weren't things like that, right? But the whole Carolingian world, I mean, structurally didn't have this need even of having a real capital. I mean, it's the same way how the political military dynamics of the empire worked, necessitated of the emperor to move constantly across Europe for the military expeditions and so on. And so the and even in fact in those cities like Paris, for instance, there were that were the most frequently the cities of most frequent stay of the king, there where the king had his own abode, etc. There were not real physical palaces there, aside from a few exceptions, because usually these residences were prepared at the moment into those abbeys or close to the bishoprics, so the cathedral, the capitulum of the cathedral. So these were things that were even not, these weren't rooted residences that corresponded to a state that was built all around, right? This in many ways represents how really the empire was something based on the armies, on the armies of horsemen, of professional horsemen that followed the king just to fight here and there. That was effectively the empire. They didn't need a structure because they didn't have the resources to build it. The quickest way was to control. So that you think, why did guys didn't centralize? Because they didn't have the resources. You can't say things like, I centralize, because at this time there is some kind of centralization, but it only derives from the ability to concentrate resources in a certain area, or being able to extend a control from a greater distance, from a certain point. But there were not other ways structurally you could manage this enormous territory. So even in places like Aachen or Pavia, where you have this royal residence, that were meant to grow like some capital on their own, they definitely remained very, very far from the long-yearned model of Rome or Constantinople. If you look at the cultural, say, cultural renaissance of the Carolingian age, you don't see a solid political and urban system that could effectively fuel a further structuration of power. This renaissance basically was supported chiefly by the ecclesiastical institutions, chiefly monasteries that were, by the way, very often and very far from any kind of urban mindset that could trigger an economical development on the same basis of the great cities of the Mediterranean or the Near East. However, as we said before, the Carolingian Renaissance has an enormous importance into the history of the West, because as much as it was timid and discreet, at the same time it was deeply rooted. So they couldn't make it to look or to be, or even to pretend to reach the levels of the ancient greatness like it was happening in the Byzantine world, but also in the Islamic world. In this sense, was a hair of that great Hellenistic, urban Hellenistic tradition. Nevertheless, it achieved this gradual and constant development of Western society, chiefly through the episcopal autonomies, the spread of monasteries, and on this, and very importantly also on the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, so chiefly rural bases that were, however, very solid. This is also another key of interpretation. How did they make it? Well, they made it because this system was to control hierarchically chiefly a rural base, and the rural base everywhere in the world this time was effectively the base of all economy. I mean, even in the most urbanized regions, everything was about effectively the agriculture. Why is that? The biggest cities were in Mesopotamia, or in Egypt, or in southern Spain, because those were some of the most fertile areas around there, right? So even though, and this is the amazing thing of the Carolingians, and the more time passes, the more fascinates me, is that they managed to create, in spite of everything, this coherent and great European area, right, of actually culturally creative centers that eventually were even to develop into kind of solid urban centers, right? Because we have seen that the bishoprics at this time were in the cities. So it's not that in the Carolingian Empire cities were not important at all. They had always been important. They simply at this time didn't emerge. They weren't really the pivot around which the empire gravitated in its essentials, but they were still kind of backing points, like balance centers that helped to coordinate the territory even from an ecclesiastical point of view, and to build therefore this net uh, of education, of administration, of something that very slowly formed and progressively was to consolidate all over Europe. Doesn't matter whether the empire was weak and fragmented and everything, the local rulers did everything that they wanted on their own, but this was still there and it was uniform. So it's something that survived the political dimension. It was strictly cultural, and it was about having an homogeneous model of intellectual production, of writing, of manuscript production that was to produce in the Middle Ages a huge amount of knowledge, a huge amount of written culture. So the myth of the Middle Ages as the Dark Age is effectively, I believe, truly and sincerely, honestly, one of the most stupid things that has ever been conceived by our own civilization. I don't understand how, of course, how this can be still believed today, which is based, I believe, on people's stupidity in general, but how it could have been conceived at a broader level in the past. Something that amazes me. However, this is pretty much it. And there will be a lot to talk about, and I promise we will keep analyzing these problems. And there is a lot to say, especially in looking at this dual dimension of these two worlds that were developing in parallel and that you can't confrontate at the time. It's useful because they were, after all, similar worlds. I mean, even if, but it's exactly because they're similar that we can stress the differences, because they're kind of easier to frame, right? So these comparisons can help, in my opinion, and should be done increasingly more frequently, instead of conceiving history like, I just study my backyard because that's all what I'm interested in history for, right? It can't work like that, because you can't effectively understand the Carolingian world if you don't know the Byzantine world, if you don't know the Abbasid world. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense, and it's bad that this general perspective is increasingly refused in favor of the narrowing down of the kind of localistic perspective. It's not just local, because it's fine to study local history, but this is localistic, which means I enclose myself into it, but I don't want to know anything else. So this is effectively impossible, because this system was heavily interconnected, way more than we have been told, and it can't be. It's a new frontier of research, by the way. The understanding how the political models, especially the imperialistic models at this time, were shared. I mean, if you look at the Anglo-Saxon world, you find that Anglo-Saxon kings named themselves effectively sometimes like Basileus, like literally the Byzantine title for the emperor. And you say, wait, but these are Anglo-Saxons. Where are they calling themselves like that? I mean, even in Greek. Because, okay, imperator, well, fine, it's the emperor in Latin, but these guys were calling themselves Basileus, so why? You have to understand these things. You have to be able to go beyond and realizing that these people were constantly informed about whatever was going on out there. That the idea of the Middle Ages, dominated by ignorance about everything was outside and just concentrated on the local little things, is comic fiction at best. And again, I don't know why these concepts are still so deeply rooted into popular culture, but whatever. For now, I hope it's everything. I think I stop here. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel for if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.